Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national television channel, Doordarshan, about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and key developments in important regions of the world that have an impact on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are doing a deep dive into a phenomenon which is usually in the backdrop of international politics, but is now coming to the foreground. This is nuclear weapons and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. These are taboo weapons for usage in warfare, but increasingly we find that there is a discourse around bringing them into battle and using this to settle scores. So it's a dangerous moment we are in. So what is this all about, and this nuclear arms race that is potentially starting, how will it impact on international security and on India's security? These are the themes of the show. And to discuss this with me, I have a scholar who has written about nuclear proliferation and disarmament issues and has recently published a new book about this, Dr. Kanica Rakhra. Dr. Rakhra is at the Kautilya School of Public Policy in Hyderabad and is a well-regarded upcoming scholar. Welcome to Indian Diplomacy, Kanica. You know, the US President Donald Trump recently came up with a very startling announcement that they will restart nuclear testing after a moratorium going back to 1992. So for 30 plus years they have not done overground testing, and the US already has a 5,000 plus nuclear arsenal, and yet President Trump has said that others are testing, and that Russia and China will be even with the US in 5 years, and therefore he says on equal basis we also will now test nuclear weapons. So this has in a way opened the genie out of the bottle. So I wanted your thoughts to start with on what is the motivation of the US in wanting to overcome this old moratorium and test again. I mean, because it already has such a massive arsenal, isn't it? So what is the strategic calculus of the US as per your reading, and why are they talking about this nuclear competition? This was all Cold War era logic, isn't it? So in the third decade of the 21st century, why are they talking about testing nuclear weapons all over again?
First of all, Sreeram, thank you for inviting me to your program. The reason could be multiple, because there is geopolitical competition that is thriving currently within the world, right? When we are seeing this happen, one of the key things that comes out is if China is developing something, Russia is developing something, US would not want to be behind in terms of developments that are happening. So I'm presuming that a lot of where President Trump's ideas come from are also from what he's seeing happen around the globe. They may warrant a little bit more introspection in terms of whether it's really required at this point of time. Personally, at this point of time, having read or studied nuclear policies for some time, I don't think that we necessarily need to go into nuclear testing at this in this hour. However, we see that once Donald Trump has announced this, there may be a furore or a global fallout of this discussion as well.
And Kanika, I mean, Trump has even said that we are number one and that the others are going to catch up with us. But actually, if you look at the arsenals, Russia has a slightly larger arsenal overall, isn't it? So let's talk a bit about what the US has, and they have been, I'm sure, testing what they call subcritically and, in terms of experimentation without actually doing overground testing, right, for all this while. So they are continuing to probably modernize their nuclear arsenal anyway. So this whole, narrative around converting the Pentagon from a Department of Defense into Department of War and authorizing them to conduct nuclear tests, what is the signaling? I mean, big powers have often used this nuclear card more like to bully and blackmail smaller countries, isn't it? So your reading of what is going on with the US?
So a lot of what you see if we just look at what has happened in December 2025, right? So one, we have the national security strategy that came out, and then you have the NDAA that came out, which were diametrically, or at least they didn't necessarily where they weren't symmetrical in terms of their approach. So one of the key things that comes out is while the NSS is more of a political document that's trying to put out ideas in a specific way. You have the NDAA, which is saying that no, we need to ensure that defense is NATO is one of our priorities. Even though the NSS is saying that Europe needs to put in more within NATO and within the partnership with the US. So you have these sort of contradictory things that are coming out of the US at this point of time, which leave a lot of space in terms of trying to figure out where the direction of the US is going to be. So while we take what President Trump has said at face value, because he is the President of the United States, I would also say that there may be some merit in trying to see what follows through in those statements, rather than just take that statement and think that it will lead to a proliferation of nuclear testing.
Yeah, so I think we'll have to actually see whether they go to overground testing again after 33, 34 years, and that then what kind of ripple effect it will have on the others. The other big player, of course, is Russia. I mean, historically, they have a huge stockpile. And they also have a very large arsenal of what is called tactical nuclear weapons, which are lower yield but are apparently for usage in real battle. And they have been threatening to use it, and they've said their nukes are on standby in Belarus in the context of their war in Ukraine. So Russia has also withdrawn from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Its ratification in 2023 is saying that they don't want any strategic asymmetry with the US. And Russia, of course, is a master at always showcasing their latest nuclear capable missiles and delivery systems. So the brinkmanship is on. There's no doubt about, at least rhetorically, is happening, Kanica. So from the Russian perspective, what do you think is driving this, increasing rancor with the US on this matter, where they are, the US is saying that Russia is even testing something called hydronuclear weapons and all these things. And what exactly is going on from the Russian point of view, you think, especially in the context of the war that they are waging in Eastern Europe? What is the role of nuclear weapons in all this? Because at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a conventional war, but that taboo seems to have been, at least in the official discourse, they're all threatening to use nuclear weapons and go to any extent. So what is going on there?
So with Russia, we do see a lot of saber rattling that's happening, especially since the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted. And you see that the more you push Russia into a corner, it does tend to use the nuclear laser as its final weapon that it would use, and it would not shy away from using. However, we have not seen much action in terms of whether we can say that Russia is actually trying to use nuclear weapons on the ground with Ukraine, or in other cases either. The other thing that also happens is we need to be a little cautious of is when the US claims that Russia is doing these tests or that it may have more tactical weapons in the future. There is a lot of presumption that also comes because US also has its own fears when it comes to Russia, especially in US Congress and US political machinery. There is some structures that may assume that US would act in a specific, Russia may act in a specific way. That may not necessarily always be true, because we see recent documents that have come out also which keep a tab on Russia's developments, that what US may have presumed about Russia and China may not necessarily may not be something that both have followed through in terms of their developments of their nuclear weapons, whether they be tactical or strategic.
Yeah, so then there is bluster, I guess, on all sides, and there's also exaggeration. But I don't know if we can take any comfort in that. I mean, because, whether tactical nukes can be used or not, is really open, and we don't know whether there are enough guardrails checking this, isn't it? And in the Russian case, there's always, I think they still assume parity with the US, right? Even though Russia is economically far behind, the US is no longer even considered a great power, unlike China, but still Russia has that, post-imperial kind of an identity where, it was a big empire, it was a big great power, and therefore wants to use probably this nuclear card also to send a message that we still matter, isn't it? It's more like a status affirmation thing for them.
Well, status affirmation is something that's deeply entrenched with all nuclear weapon states, whether we like it or not. But there's also a point that I'd like to raise over here is about nostalgia. Like you mentioned, that Russia has this sense of being an imperial power, being past civilization because of its civilization history. There is this case that comes through with nostalgia, where you feel that you need to justify also to your state, to your people. It's true for Russia as much as it's true for China, as much as it's true for the United States. So we shouldn't take any special case in terms of for Russia in this context. However, if we were to look at the idea of what you talked about, the saber rattling and the idea that tactical nuclear weapons are growing, this is definitely not a good sign, because the language in which international state actors are communicating with each other is very, very, at this point of time, disruptive. It's not looking for solutions. It's not positive in its perspective. It's constantly looking at one-upmanship, which is creating more fear within other smaller states.
Yeah, and the arms reduction treaties, the arms control, the entire regimes seem to be collapsing like nine pins, and especially US, Russia, most of the agreements viewers have fallen aside. Only there's something called a New START. That's the only one which limits the overall size of nuclear weapons that may still survive, but many others have fallen by the wayside. So it is a worrisome, trend indeed. Kanika, nowadays, no discussion on disarmament or nuclear issues is complete without talking about China, because they are actually ramping up their arsenal, and it's being called the fastest growing arsenal in the world. And by most accounts, they have at least 600 nuclear weapons and are aiming to build many more at a very fast pace. They have also not tested over ground, but they seem to have the capability, the technological ability to do it underground or in laboratory conditions through simulations and so on. So what are the Chinese ambitions here, and frankly, why do you need 600 or 1000 or 5 or 2000 or more nuclear weapons? Is this again just the status game that we're talking about, or is there some even real military logic to this, saying if the Americans have this much, then we cannot have less because there is some kind of second strike, parity or whatever? We heard a lot of these during the Cold War, right? During the nuclear arms race, where each side would say that I must have equal or more than the other. So what is the Chinese logic?
So when we look at China's nuclear arsenal, one of the key things that we need to know is that for China, the only adversary that matters is the United States. So everything it develops in terms of its nuclear arsenal, in terms of its military capability, is with the focus of looking at securing itself, and also on how it can protect itself from the United States or compete with the United States. This is a key thing that is a part of the Chinese psyche. However, it is also true that China is not necessarily getting into an arms race of the kind that we saw during the Cold War between Russia and the United States, because China is also learning from the past. It's also making sure that it understands what are the factors that work and what don't work, and whether it needs to fall into the same traps that Russia and the United States fell into years ago. So it's being cautious of its international history when it's engaging in its developments, and it's not necessarily engaging in an arms race the way you were referring to. I would say it's getting into an arms race where it's developing its technology, it's developing its nuclear arsenal, but it's keeping it to a point where it cannot be said that China is in an arms race with the United States, which also makes it difficult then for the United States to say that you need to come into an arms control treaty. Because if Russia and the United States were developing parallel to each other and were raising the bar in terms of nuclear warheads, you were also, both states are then forced to come on the table to discuss nuclear arms control in some manner. But China has been cautious of that engagement, and thus it's difficult for the United States then to ask China to then come on the table in terms of arms control.
Yeah, I mean, they would not want arms control because they are still relatively behind. And the gap is still, 600 and 5,000 are like, chalk and cheese.
That's what I'm saying. So they are not increasing it to a point where it can come to getting on the table of arms control, but they're also increasing it to a point where it is making the United States uncomfortable.
Right,
so it's a cautious process in which they're engaging.
Yeah, and in terms of the missiles and, the entire ability, the triad system, they have publicly demonstrated their ability to strike anybody, anywhere on earth, with the intercontinental ballistic missiles and all that. The Chinese have very advanced delivery mechanisms, isn't it? And this is the other part, isn't it, Kanika? Because it's not only nuclear weapons per se, but also the delivery systems. And usually the arms races involve both these interrelated sets. And there, I think the Chinese are actually developing very fast.
Yes, that's true. The Chinese are, as I said earlier also, that the Chinese are being very smart in their approach of developing nuclear arsenal and their weaponry. So whether it is with respect to missiles or whether it's with respect to tactical nuclear weapons or intercontinental missiles, they are being cautious in their approach and they're learning from history. So while they are increasing their weaponry in specific areas, they're not giving the space for the United States to call it on the table in terms of negotiations of any kind.
Which talks also of their ambition to do further vertical proliferation, which I'm sure they have in mind, and it remains to be seen how far they'll go. I mean, right now, like you're saying, maybe it's still limited 600. 600 is more than all the other nuclear weapon states except Russia and the US. So they are ahead, and in that sense, because there are 9 nuclear states, and compared to the other 7 or other 6, China is still bulking up, so that's something to be watched. Coming to India now, Kanika, we have this moratorium in place since the 1998 Pokhran 2 tests, right? And we have not conducted any overground tests since then, and we have always said that we have a credible minimal deterrent, and it's sufficient, with including second strike capability and triad capability and all these things. So therefore, it has not been seen as necessary to conduct more tests. But since Trump has, stirred this hornet's nest, there have been calls among a strategic community in India to rethink our moratorium. And it's now 27 years, and the technology has changed, the delivery systems have changed, everything needs to be updated, and you can't do everything through subcritical tests or simulations or computer simulations, and therefore you need to do real tests, quote unquote, like what we did in 1998. There is an argument for that. So what is your thinking on the Indian moratorium, and will it remain in place, and what are our options to update the arsenal, as they are saying, without having to go for full testing?
Sreeram, that's a very complicated question, and I'm going to try and address it. So, what happened with India and the United States after the Pokhran test happened was that India gave created this moratorium that was not imposed by any other state. It was India that chose to do this moratorium. And because of India's first step that it took, it was also helpful in how India-US nuclear deal comes into place, how India's nuclear sector opens up. Yes, we saw this in December 2025. We can see that India's new bill has come out with respect to the nuclear bill that has come out, right? Where we are seeing that there's going to be more private players in the nuclear industry.
That's for peaceful energy, right? That's not the military program, yeah.
That's not, but it's also largely linked with the fact that India decided to say this, so there were so many other benefits that came out of it. But it was also based on the fact that the United States also had a moratorium. So when Donald Trump makes this statement that he says that the moratorium no longer exists for the United States, and we will test if we have to, it questions everything in terms of the international structure that has been placed by the United States. So it remains to be seen how the United States acts on what President Trump has said, but it is definitely going to open a lot more questions in different parts of the world, including India, on what this means for India as well. While the requirements of testing are something that scientists can speak better about, and it mostly has been analyzed that you can manage with subcritical testing and computer simulations. If there is a global move towards nuclear testing, there will be a pressure on India as well to then do some tests of its own to ensure that its deterrence is credible.
Right. So it's all interrelated, it seems. I mean, this is all a relative phenomenon. Kanika, we've looked at main players, and there are also, Israel North Korea, Pakistan, and possibly Iran, which is kind of like a threshold state, but they may have been held back by the recent Israel-Iran conflict, where the US also bombed Iranian nuclear facilities. But if you look at the big picture, all these actors, these 9 states, and potentially more who may want to acquire these, because wars are increasing, geopolitical competition is increasing. We are in a so-called new Cold War era as opposed to the original Cold War. So in that sense, the overall conditions seem to be in favor of reopening this whole can of worms, isn't it? And it does strike to me as something that we need to be concerned about. On the other hand, there are so-called realists who would say that it doesn't matter, let more people get nuclear weapons, let there be 50 or 100 or 20 or 30 or 50 nuclear weapon states, and it will solve all the problems. Nobody will go to war with each other because of mutually assured destruction. So you've written this new book about disarmament, including highlighting Indian women voices. What is your perspective on this debate about whether testing or even vertical or horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons, is it good for international security, or is it actually something that could lead to real usage of nukes one day, or even a nuclear holocaust, something that we have not seen since Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So your thoughts on which direction international security is heading on the nuclear axis?
I would personally not be in favor of most states going into the nuclear domain. While there is a strong argument saying that if all states have nuclear weapons, then no one will be under attack and there'll be mutually assured destruction. But as we can see in the case of India and Pakistan, it's not that they have not gone into war, or even it creates what is called the stability-instability paradox. So you have stability at the nuclear level, but there is instability at the conventional level that consistently sustains. So it may not be best for most states to go nuclear unless the requirements are critical in terms of security considerations, one way or the other. However, when it comes to looking at disarmament, it is important to understand that our language, while we understand that conflicts are growing and there is constantly a space where we are looking at more conflicts in the region, whether it's Israel, Palestine, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, there is the need for us as state actors to look at what it means to be in a world where we can think of disarmament. So I just like to point out that this is the book that that got released in 2025. It's called Emerging from the Shadows, essays on disarmament by Indian women. So the idea behind the book was just to bring out voices that speak about how far we are from disarmament, how possible it is for disarmament to happen from an Indian perspective, where we see Russia, Ukraine, we see China, Russia, we see United States. We're hoping that at least some voices from India can make a difference in terms of thinking about disarmament, at least, if nothing else.
Yeah, and what should we as Indians feel like this is some kind of competition, and that we should also be catching up with the others? I mean, that's always the traditional national security inclination, isn't it? That others are going ahead and we can't be left behind, like you mentioned. Or should we just be reassured that we've got the basic minimal, and we should actually be advocating for this broader theme of disarmament, which requires actually all these heavily armed states to start giving up what they already have acquired over the decades. And so that's a much harder task. So what's your view? I mean, should we be continuing to advocate and push for universal disarmament, which seems unrealistic, or should we just get into the act of, okay, the Chinese have 600, I have only 180, so I need to build up now, and I don't care about Pakistan because it's anyway weak, but the Chinese are going to be our long-term adversary, so we can't have a disparity with them. What's your view? Should we fall into this competitive logic, or is there some cooperative logic through which we can come out of all this?
While the book I have written is about disarmament, I'm well aware of the fact that disarmament is something that we cannot discuss that comfortably at this point of time between states. The idea was just to initiate conversation on disarmament, but not sort of say that India needs to take the lead on disarmament, because India has its own national security interests at this point of time, which constrain its hand in terms of how it can approach disarmament today. However, I would also not agree that India needs to jump on the wagon just because every other state is jumping and get into an arms race, where it gets pushed into a corner and it's forcing its economic might into different directions. The idea would be to be smart about what is the requirement on the ground, how much do we need to invest in our nuclear missile capability, and how much we need to focus on what other developments are happening around the world. So we need to be cognizant of the world around us, but not jump into a bandwagon which says that if the US is testing, if Russia is testing, India has to test. That shouldn't be the idea at all. It's not something I would definitely recommend.
Right. Viewers, a very interesting conversation with Dr. Kanica Rakhra of the Kautilya School of Public Policy. And we have discussed the motivations and the calculus of all the central players in this what could be potentially a new nuclear arms race, which has been triggered by the US's announcement that they will restart testing. Nothing has happened yet, thankfully, but once this has been mainstreamed, it may be difficult to turn it back as well. So there is a real chance that we are looking at not just heightened geopolitical rivalries and great power competition, but also as a part of that, or as a subset of that, more nuclear proliferation, including by those who already have massive arsenals. So it's not a pretty picture, and we cannot be sure about the rationality behind the non-use of nuclear weapons. I mean, this is something that advocates for peace have always raised, that just because there has been no nuclear attack since 1945 on Japan doesn't mean that it will not happen again. And it's a question of what the rationality is also relative, and it's also circumstantial. And if wars break out, then we cannot be sure. So I think it is sanity to not actually restart nuclear testing, ideally speaking. But then, as Dr. Rakhra said, India has national security compulsions. We have our two nuclear armed adversaries on our western and northern borders, and we will need to keep a watch on their technological as well as numerical growth of arsenals, of their nuclear arsenals. And we will also need to reassess in a very, very open-minded way as to where our security lies and what kind of balance we need to strike between conventional and non-conventional, and within non-conventional, the so-called weapons of mass destruction, what do we need to do to keep up with the others. But end of the day, the competitive logic may harm everyone and may not be good for international peace and security. Let me thank Dr. Rakhra for your research and for your work and for sharing your valuable insights on a topic that is usually seen as very abstract or something that we need not worry about because it's somewhere in the backdrop. But I think it's high time we did this. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So viewers, nuclear weapons are back in circulation, at least in the rhetoric and in the propaganda of all the principal players. Armed conflicts are rising, great power rivalry is increasing as we speak, and regional conflicts are also erupting or restarting. So there is a risk associated with nuclear weapons today, which was not there even like 5 or 10 years ago. So we need to be cognizant of these risks, and we need to cautiously navigate this new nuclear arms race, so that one, we are not left behind, but two, we are also not contributing to a bigger global crisis. So thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.